Hello everyone, thank you for being here this evening at the third community workshop on a potential Richmond vacant property tax. Tonight, we are interested in receiving feedback from everyone, including concerns regarding blight, opinions regarding vacant properties, potential exemptions, as well as services to be funded. In the chat, I have included the email address if you'd like to send any feedback after the workshop, as well as the city's webpage for this project. If you'd like to review any documents, past workshops, or any sort of updates. In addition, updates are going to be posted in the city manager's weekly report. Next slide. And with that, I will turn it over to Antonio.
Buenas noches y gracias por su participación en el taller comunitario. Traducción en español está disponible. Puede cambiar su preferencia de idioma al español al darle clic en el icono de globo interpretación en la parte baja de su pantalla. Gracias.
Thank you, Antonio. So real quick, just want to go over some of the items that will be helpful as we move forward. If you have any questions, feel free to include your question in the Q&A box at the bottom or in the chat. Also, you have the option at the end, if you have any questions or comments, to raise your hand and we will call on you and unmute you. If you are on the phone, you will want to press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. We will also repeat these instructions at the end just in case anybody needs them. As I mentioned earlier, we will be posting this video as well as the slides on the city's website. If you don't have the link, the way to get there is if you go to the City of Richmond website, click on departments, then to finance, and on the left-hand side, if you go towards the bottom, you'll see potential vacant property tax. And with that, next slide, and I will turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Samantha. My name is Chris Coulter. I'm with SCI Consulting Group. Tonight we have a brief webinar scheduled, and most importantly, we're here to learn more about what you all think in terms of the vacant property tax, the potential VPT, and things like exemptions and any questions and concerns that you may have, and we'll be able to prompt some of those questions, and hopefully the presentation will spur some other questions and comments from the community. So on the left, we have the list of the city team, and on the right, it's SCI Consulting Group team. SCI has been contracted with the city to explore a potential vacant property tax. So I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide unless there's any more comment from the city side.
No, you are good to go.
Great. Okay, so to reiterate, tonight's objectives, we'll go over an overview of the proposed vacant property tax. We'll talk about some of the common exemptions for a vacant property tax, and then most importantly, receive the public input. But just to cover some of the questions that might occur, there won't be any real decisions made tonight. This is more of an informational presentation, but most importantly, an opportunity for the city to receive feedback. So background on a potential vacant property tax. Since the summer, the city has been exploring this potential VPT, and we've had a number of meetings internally, and as well as 2 previous public workshops held over the summer to solicit feedback and as part of this program, this feedback work, a mailed survey was sent out to the property owners, which I believe a lot of the attendees currently may have received and returned. The goals for a VPT involve structurally balancing the budget, the general fund, as well as specific proposed funding from the VPT that could potentially impact the city's work to address blight, code compliance, code enforcement, as well as encouraging the use of and the development of vacant properties. And so there are some benefits as a side note to actual development of these types of vacant properties and underused properties, which have been known to be hotspots for crime, for criminal activity, as well as illegal dumping and overall blight, such as graffiti. And so when properties are put into use, these negative aspects of a vacant property tend to be alleviated. And to go backwards here, I mentioned a mailed survey in the fall, in late November. 7,000 surveys were mailed to randomly selected registered voters within the City of Richmond. And the survey included an informational page explaining what a vacant property tax would look like, as well as potential funding opportunities from a VPT. The goals of the survey were to understand voters' priorities. Also, with the survey were a set of questions that allowed for respondents to indicate their priorities and preferences for a number of different types of funding opportunities. And with the survey, there was also an opportunity for respondents to write in their feedback in written form. And with these surveys, of course, there was also an invitation to this meeting tonight, which we are holding currently. And so one of the great things about this opportunity is that the feedback that we receive, that the city gathers through this process, is going to ultimately impact any kind of a vacant property tax ordinance, which will include all sorts of things like exemptions and potential spending revenue. The timeline of the project is in front of you on the screen. Basically, input sessions have been held over the past 6 months. The survey results are potentially to be presented to the Richmond City Council later this month in January the 25th. For a June tax measure, a June tax election in the city, the tax ordinance would need to be set in March, and the earliest that the VPT could go on the ballot would be in June 22 in the June 22 election. The actual implementation of the tax would occur later. You'd essentially see about a 1.5 year time frame for the window to finally open and for vacant properties and underused properties to potentially become subject to a tax. So you'd be looking at two full fiscal years for that tax collection to actually occur, as you can see on the screen. Now, to get into more of the details about what a vacant property tax is, these taxes are placed on underused and unused properties, so that could include a vacant lot, that's bare land. That could also include an empty home that sits empty for the vast majority of the year. And that might also include warehouses, empty warehouses, or empty commercial buildings. The general collection process is sort of an identification phase where the properties are researched and identified as being vacant or underused. Property owners would then be notified of the potential placement of the tax, as well as offering the property owner an opportunity to either dispute the tax placement or apply for an exemption. And VPTs are not exactly a common tax. However, they have been successfully implemented in the city of Oakland, and as well as in Canada in the city of Vancouver. In both of these cities, the VPTs do generate significant revenue. There is a considerable amount of work that goes into identifying properties as well as administering the applications for exemptions, as well as community outreach. Now, to get into a little bit more finer detail, a vacant parcel, so we're talking about parcels when we're talking about taxed properties. A vacant property would potentially be in use less than 50 days in a calendar year, and actually it would be less than 30 days in a calendar year for the proposed Richmond vacant property tax. So you can look at that. The number 50 occurs on your screen, but that should say 30. A vacant property would include an undeveloped parcel. There's no building, no structure. Essentially, it's raw ground, your classic vacant lot. There's a couple of exceptions to that notion. There are certain property owners who own a home that they live in, and there's a parcel contiguous to the property that's used as a side yard. So that type of property could potentially be excluded from a vacant property tax, as well as properties that may serve as ingress and egress, such as driveways. Other examples, less common so, would be developed properties. That includes like residential single-family homes that sit unused. If a house sits empty for anything for most of the year, that property would potentially be subject to the tax if no one's living in there less than 30 days. That could include also apartment buildings that sit empty. And as I said, non-residential buildings like commercial properties, condominiums, and as well as ground floor commercial units that sit on main thoroughfares where there's loft space or other sorts of space above a ground floor unit that is vacant. And as one idea that is also included in the survey that was mailed, there's a potential, and we would actually like to hear any comments from any attendees, if anyone has any thoughts on the option that only blighted properties would be subject to the tax. That is one of the reasons for the community outreach, is to learn more about the priority of the community in terms of that potential feature of the tax, only tax blighted properties. And on your screen here is an example of a contiguous property. This is just you see the property labeled number 2 is a house, and then the property next to it is a side yard. And in this example, if the side yard, number 1 here, is not blighted, if it's maintained, that would not be subject to the tax. It would be considered in use if that was included in the tax ordinance. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, that's one of the reasons why we're here. We'd love to hear any ideas or comments, feedback on this type of contiguous parcel exclusion. Here is a classic example of an unused empty warehouse attracting blight. This was essentially, it's an abandoned building. So if no one's using it legally for 30 days, then that would be subject to the tax, as an example. This here is a ground floor commercial space. As I had mentioned, you have, in this example, residential spaces above, but the commercial area on the street facing is vacant, and that would potentially be subject to the tax if it's not used for 30 days in a calendar year. The potential tax rates, VPT tax rates, relatively high tax rates compared to other types of taxes. The tiered example here exists as a range based on the size of the parcel. And so you'd have a $3,000 per year tax up to $8,000 per year based on if the parcel is either a small parcel under 5,000 square feet all the way up to a large parcel greater than 1 acre, which would see 8,000 with a middle range of 5,000. Condominiums would in this example be a flat rate of 3,000 per condo sitting empty, as well as ground floor. Exemptions from a VPT are one of the key components of a tax to allow for certain situations to be exempted from a tax. And common exemptions that exist for the proposed Richmond vacant property tax are listed here on this page. There would potentially be an exemption for very low income owners. These are HUD, housing and urban development guidelines, and you can see the numbers here would be adjusted every year based on the new HUD guidelines, based on the size of the owner's household. A low income local senior for seniors who live in the area would also have a separate exemption available potentially that would be based as well on an index, and if the senior lived in the city of Richmond. There could potentially be exemptions for nonprofit organizations. These are examples, and properties that are under active development would also be exempt from a tax. That would include folks who have submitted an application to have their property development developed. So someone who has a planning application, as well as parcels that are actually under active construction, or a building permit application has been submitted and these permits remain active. Those types of situations could be exempt from the tax. And one other note, which we would love to hear any feedback on, is that the possibility to require that the property is in code compliance, that's not blighted, as a condition of approval for an exemption. So that is one caveat that could be included, and feedback is welcome on that issue. Other exemptions, and these three are some of the more nebulous exemptions. The idea of a financial hardship. What could possibly constitute a financial hardship? These exemptions would need to be specifically identified in a tax ordinance, so that the actual administration of the exemption can be possible. And that's one thing that would just be written down into the ordinance. So if there's any kind of feedback, that would potentially inform the actual tax ordinance that would be presented to the voters. So any comments or feedback on that is certainly welcome. Owners who may not be able to develop their parcel due to a demonstrable hardship that is not financial. So these are very open-ended ideas at the moment, and would need to be hammered out into the tax ordinance. But if there are any feedback, we would certainly be happy to hear for any ideas in terms of a financial hardship or a demonstrable hardship. And this last one is a little bit more having to do with the physical constraints of the property. The property potentially could be not developable due to geologic conditions, soils conditions. It could be contaminated. So these types of properties would potentially be exempted from the tax as well. And with that, we've reached the questions and comments phase of the presentations. Thanks so much for sitting through the presentation, and hopefully if there are any questions that that need to be answered, we can go over those. But now's really the chance for us to hear some feedback in terms of, you know, maybe personal anecdotes about vacant properties, or as well as the feedback that obviously we've been talking about receiving in terms of exemptions, how the public feels about certain exemptions, if certain exemptions should not be included, if perhaps blighted properties should be the only types of properties that should be subject to the tax, or if exemptions should also require that the property be maintained in order to be approved for an exemption. So you can use the chat box or really the Q&A box on the Zoom interface and type in the questions, and we'll go ahead and answer those. But we can also put you up on the podium, and you can ask your question in the traditional way. So go ahead and let us know if there are any questions.
So Chris, it looks like Kevin typed one into the chat. Do we want to do that one first, and then we'll go over to Bruce and then Lisa?
Great. Thank you, Samantha. Yes, so how do we define blight? Is the definition in the ordinance proposal, would it need to be in the caseload of code enforcement before the tax applies, or have received complaints? Now that's a great question, and the definition of blight would likely be tied to the city's existing code ordinances, which makes sense because they've already been adopted and approved and debated at the city council level. Now, this type of tax would be looking backwards. So, you know, potentially if the property was blighted and there was records of, you know, nuisance or enforcement, that would potentially identify the property as blighted. But ultimately, the ordinance would need to hammer out, you know, some of those details that you had requested. But those are excellent points, and ultimately, the tax ordinance would need to address each one of those issues that you just raised, Kevin.
All right, so we will move on to Bruce. Bruce, I'm going to allow you to talk.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you. First, you mentioned, thanks for the clear presentation. One of the purposes addressed are to address blight, code compliance, code enforcement, hotspots for crime, and illegal dumping that are among the purposes. So I'd suggest exempting properties that are not causing any of those problems. For example, properties in your residential area that are clean or landscaped and well-maintained and not blight, not dumping or any of those things. So that's one suggestion. The other one is the exemption for side yard. There might be a better term than side yard. The word side yard to me implies a rectilinear street development pattern. You can imagine situations that the vacant property is between a residence, a house, and owned by the same owner as the parcel having the house, but is between the house and the street and not between the house and an adjacent house. So perhaps just exempting contiguous properties would be clearer than using the term side yard, which may not apply in all situations. So those are my two suggestions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes. And you're exactly right. The side yard, that the word that would be in the ordinance is contiguous. And so you're exactly right. And that is the reason that you expressed is the reason why it would be a contiguous property exemption.
Thank you, Bruce. And we will move on to Lisa Johnson.
Hi. I don't know how many people still have their hand raised, so I have a few questions, so I can ask one, give a couple comments.
I'm sorry, I pressed the wrong button. Lisa,
Oh.
keep going. I'm so sorry.
So I can ask my one question, give a couple comments, and then come back and ask my other one out of respect for the other people on the workshop. So my first one, I listened to the first two workshops that were on the city's website. And I guess I want to kind of ask this question again. Somebody asked it, like, what is really the purpose of this tax? And the consultant answered it by saying the city is interested in a structurally sound budget, first and foremost. And some of the funds could be used for the city's general fund. So that to me sounds like the intent is to address our budget deficit, which means this would be yet again a general tax and not a special use tax. So if its real intent is to provide funds for the city to address blight and illegal dumping, then I would like to hear from Shasa and Lena if this is really going to be recommended to the council as a true special use tax so that we can be guaranteed that these funds will go towards those intended purpose instead of into the general fund to address our budget deficits. So that's kind of my first comment. And two feedbacks which I can give are, I do think that only blighted properties should even be being considered for this tax right now. And the second other recommendation that I would have right now at this point in time is I don't think it's fair for nonprofits to be exempt from this tax either. So I know those have been things that have come up in prior conversations. So I did want to give my feedback on that. And then I'll let you answer my question about this as being as proposed as a special use and guaranteeing the funds go towards treating blight and dumping versus a general use tax.
Thank you, Lisa. Those comments are very well taken. And at this time, the tax ordinance is still under development. And I think one of the things that the city council will be tasked with, obviously, is finalizing the tax ordinance. And so we would certainly, while it's wonderful that we're receiving your feedback now, and I would hope and encourage you to also provide that feedback at the city council level, should this tax be presented to them for inclusion on the ballot in June and in the future.
All right, up next is Mia. Her question is in the chat. She asks, how would financial hardship be evaluated and what is the required proof?
So financial hardship, so we can go into this a little bit more. We didn't really talk about examples. There are some options that are under considerations, such as somebody who potentially was deployed overseas for the calendar year in a military role, as well as somebody who potentially maybe the property owner had passed away either in the calendar year or the immediately preceding calendar year potentially, as well as potentially a financial hardship due to medical, like a significant medical event could be considered a hardship. So those types of things would have specific documents that would be reviewed as part of an exemption process. Those types of documents would be sort of like an internal policy at the administrative level, but the actual ordinance would need to spell out these, in order to make the tax administratable and clear cut. The actual specific hardships would be listed in the tax ordinance. And as I said, those three things or four that I just listed are potentially under consideration. Other things that could be hardships would be possibly properties that are in legal dispute, like a title of a property may be in dispute. And there's obviously easily attainable documents that an applicant could provide to be approved for the tax for one of those hardship exemptions. So hopefully I answered your question.
I also see Mia's hand raised, so I'm going to allow her to talk.
Thank you so much, and thank you for answering my question, Chris. And I also just thank you for this research. As part of the team at Richmond Land, we're at the local community land trust. We are very well aware of the geographic inequities that the city of Richmond is faced with, and the need to come up with creative solutions to meet certain deficits and being able to deploy. I, was part of the team that authored a report in Oakland around short-term rentals and the impact of vacant units there. Much of that research was taken into consideration by the city council member who adopted the Vacant Property Tax law there. And, I think what we see is that, the demand for our housing is really being driven by so many other causes beyond just the shortage of housing supply. I think we saw very clearly through other campaigns that the reason why we can't find housing, or why people who have grew up in Richmond can't afford to purchase houses in Richmond now, is because there are, not everyone, but there are a lot of folks that are playing into the sit and wait game to see if property values go up to sort of flip their houses. And I do think that this is a way to sort of open up the market to people who are from the city, who want to stay in this community, to stay there. So I agree that, including residential properties in here can support some of that, some of those efforts to deter that. I also am curious, I think one of the unintended consequences that can result of a vacant property tax is that, owners decide that they can't absorb the cost of a tax. And so they put their properties back on the market, which could be great for, industrial sites and such, but it can also just, really drive up some of the displacement pressures that we're seeing. And so I'm just wondering if there's considerations around how some of these revenues can go towards projects by local developers to bring affordable housing and other community benefit projects into the community, and if there will be an earmark for that as well. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments and the question, Mia. Yes. So there's the notion of like development assistance, I think has come up before in some of the feedback that's been solicited and received. And so potentially that could be included in the tax ordinance, or as part of like an additional program that was adopted by the city council. And at this time, I don't really have any concrete answer in terms of if it will be included or not, but we would also, encourage you to follow along and provide that feedback at the council level so that they're aware of that and that it could potentially be included.
Thank you.
Chris, this is Lena. I guess, given the comments from Lisa and the comments from Mia, is there a little bit of a, I mean, one with the general tax, it seems like there's more flexibility to modify allocation of programs over time, depending on needs, versus if it's a specific tax, then it really would restrict the time. So I guess I'm just wondering if, have you seen it in other places where maybe there's both intertwined in the work?
So we haven't seen a vacant property tax include specifically a development assistance program, but that would, that would be an option for the tax. I think there would be some exploration needed in terms of whether it would need to be set up as, a specified use tax or a general tax, if some of that money was going to be funneled into development assistance or not. So that would need to be looked at and explored. But thank you, yes, Lena. I think given those comments, those are important features of the tax, and those are not new comments. Certainly those types of issues were raised in the Oakland vacant property tax. However, at the city council in Oakland chose not to include development assistance as part of the funding from the tax, nor was it included in the actual tax ordinance. But yes, that's why we're here today. So I think that that's certainly very valuable feedback.
Alrighty, we're going to move on to Cordell.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you, Cordell.
Good. So thank you, Sam. So thank you, Chris, for that presentation. One of the concerns I had was, let me see. This was a community member brought this to my attention that that this individual lives near the Nisham Village, and he said that there's a lot of how do I say this, a lot of blight around that area, and it's like it's filled with like trash. People like dump their stuff, and it's like, oh brother. And I said, and I know this tax will be very beneficial, so I just want to put in my 2 cents.
We thank you, Cordell. The blight issue is certainly a big issue in terms of what we've seen so far, in terms of feedback from the community, and I think that that's one of the big reasons why the city was interested in including it as part of the tax structure. So I think your comments are echoed not only on a community level, but also on a city level as well.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Cordell. We're gonna go and we're gonna move over into the chat, and I deeply apologize in advance. Trionda's questions. The first one is, how can financial hardship of an unused property when all properties in Richmond are now worth 500K plus? And then the second question is, what programs are currently in place to address blighted properties?
Okay, thank you. See, I can't read their full name. Trionda, yes. That's an excellent question. you know, the idea of what is a financial hardship, you know, somebody maybe they own a property and potentially the notion that they would be under a financial hardship is sort of in dispute. So those comments are really important. And, you know, I think some of the things that a financial hardship exemption would potentially include, you can kind of exclude certain situations. You know, that you can include criteria in a financial hardship to potentially require that someone's tax returns not show, you know, a certain amount of income for a given year. So maybe somebody may have a financial hardship, but if their tax return shows that there was enough income that they wouldn't qualify for the tax. You know, but those are valuable comments, and you know, those are certainly something that we're going to be registering and recording. And then to answer your second question, you know, the city has the code enforcement and code compliance program, which is very busy dealing with nuisance properties in order to get those properties into compliance. You know, there's certainly a very rigorous city staff and program to find these properties, address the nuisances. They send out notices, and also code inspection comes to verify that the nuisance has been abated. There's also fines that are associated with the city's already enacted programs. So that's part of the internal programs, and what this tax is sort of identifying a further need to address some of the more expanded issues with blight, so that, you know, maybe these programs are underfunded, and that there's still a need to address, despite the city's already internal efforts to do so with blighted properties. So hopefully I answered your questions.
Alrighty, next we're going to move over into the Q&A section. So first up is Anne's question. What if a business is unoccupied because of economic downturn?
Yes, thank you, Anne. That so economic downturn, I think, is sort of an important consideration, especially now with some of the difficulties that we've had with shutdowns. And so, you know, there is the opportunity to add, you know, for as part of the application process to review an exemption application, if a property owner can show that that perhaps they were shut down due to a pandemic health order, that this property would then qualify for an exemption just because they were following the law. But in terms of an economic downturn, that property owner would hopefully be able to prove that, you know, that this economic downturn affected their income in such a way that it fell into the very low income category, and then they were thus allowed to be exempted from the property based on their income not being over a certain threshold. Oh, it looks like the city economic development would like to answer this question. So.
No, I'm sorry, I pressed the wrong button. Sorry, everyone.
Great. So hopefully I answered your question. But yeah, that would hopefully be covered by the income-based exemptions.
Next question is also in the Q&A. It's from Sean. Is the primary goal to reduce blight or generate revenue?
Thank you, Sean. And this is really a a two-pronged, I think that the primary goal for a vacant property tax, if the vacant property tax in Richmond includes these blight criteria, the blight reduction and the revenue generation are going to be sort of a combined package. What we've seen from the city and what we've seen from the community is a real focus on the blight conditions and that it is impacting the community. And one of the only ways to get properties into compliance, it is really to encourage either development of the property, which in turn reduces the property's ability to attract blight, because if somebody's using the property, it becomes less of an opportunity for trash and debris and graffiti to accumulate there. So it's really a combined approach where you get a property into development, the blight is reduced, but as part of that that sort of carrot and the stick, the property tax that would be applied is meant to encourage that development, and with the added benefit that blight is reduced.
All right, we're going to do the last question in the Q&A from Kevin. He noted, I think that an exemption and/or hardship waiver will be needed. Some of the vacant parcels in Richmond have 10 or more contiguous parcels belonging to the same owner. Will each parcel be charged individually?
Great question, Kevin. So yes, if an occupied residential parcel was contiguous to one property, that one property potentially would be exempted. Now, if the ordinance was written to only exempt one contiguous property, a single contiguous property, that would mean that the other 9 would be charged, the tax rate, which could be $3,000 to $8,000 per year. So that would be per property per year. However, if the ordinance excludes contiguous properties and as well as adjoining contiguous properties, then potentially all of those properties would be exempted, but it would need to be addressed specifically in the ordinance. But potentially all of those properties would be charged individually.
All right, next up, we're going to go to Alex's question in the chat, and then we'll go to his hand that is raised. So his question or comment and question in the chat is, code compliance condition to qualify for an exemption is a good idea. Financial hardship exemptions should be conditioned on more than just household incomes and should require that owners demonstrate existence of significant barriers to developing the property. And then with that, I will also allow Alex to talk if you have any other additional comments or questions.
Yeah, hi, it's Alex. I appreciate a lot of the comments I've heard from other speakers, and I just, something that is really important here and that Cattell needs a little bit more work is that the intent of this should be really clear, especially around which properties are covered. I don't believe that this is a tax that makes sense to put forward as a budget balancing tool, but it should be aimed at generating growth and development and reducing the burden of blight, and essentially a tax that is designed very explicitly to, in a way, work itself out of a job, not something that should be, in place and, able to live with and manage over, forever. It should have a purpose and a drive, which I think gets to a lot of the concerns that people routinely raise about, okay, well, there are properties that just either can't be developed or there are economic conditions that can't be controlled. Well, the tax shouldn't penalize properties that, are in the condition because of outside forces. They should be more narrowly aimed at those properties that are, simply holding space or creating issues for the neighbors and for the city. So I think looking at exemptions in particular as being based on outside factors like economic conditions or things that are outside of the owner's control is much more meaningful and consistent than the owner's income. So, that's just one idea for how to change this so that it makes sense. And I think it's an idea that can have a lot of support as it did back in 2018. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, and those ideas and components that you raised are certainly important, especially for the hardship. So the hardship exemptions are supposed to try to cover some of those special situations that we know always pop up in life, and so some of the hardship exemptions could include like job loss, involuntary termination, and that type of exemption also I think would cover one of the previous comments regarding economic downturn. So involuntary termination is one of the ideas under consideration. As well as, like I said, a significant medical event that potentially restricted the owner from participating in their normal business activities. In addition to like a bankruptcy for a human owner, like a bankruptcy could potentially qualify for a financial hardship. And then we also have that demonstrable hardship category, which could potentially include, like the other things that I mentioned, such as deployment or inheritance of the property, death of the owner. Those types of situations are under consideration. So hopefully that addresses some of your comments.
Yeah, and I guess I'll punctuate one thing by saying that part of the intended outcome I would hope for this tax is to reduce the burden on the city for responding to and dealing with the properties and open up that capacity to provide services that people care about. And so in that light, I think having a tax be narrowly focused and a bit more surgical for also the benefit of making the administrative burden of the tax lower. Otherwise, it's somewhat counterproductive, and there may not be as much of a net benefit to the community for having it in place if it's very onerous to administer.
Thank you, Alex. We are going to move on to Mike. Mike, I believe you can unmute and ask your question or say your comment.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on Alex's comment. So I'm a general contractor and I build houses, or I have built houses. And I know just in my experience that it's not that far-fetched to get a lot or have a lot with a very low cost basis, and for it to be pretty much financially impossible to develop that lot. Whether it's just the zoning or impact fees or permit fees or just cost to build, it might just literally be impossible to build or develop a property without losing money. So if you have a lot, we want to talk about incentivizing people to build, but if you can't build without losing money, why should you be penalized by paying a tax for that? It just seems like when we're talking about incentives, it should go both ways. An incentive should be on the other end, on the city's end. If you do develop this lot, we'll, waive some sort of percentage of the impact fees or the permitting fees, a way for there to get these lots to be developed. Because as it stands, you could tax people all you want, but if you can't build on the lot, what good are we really doing?
Thank you, Mike. Those are excellent comments. And certainly there's a high cost for development of the property. And I think that's the idea of like a development assistance program for payment of the tax on a property that does have like active building applications has been considered at the city level, as well as potentially like a tax mitigation effort. You know, if I think this idea had come up in form of feedback or discussion where, you know, there could be a somebody who gets their property finally developed and had paid previous taxes, you know, those types of mitigation efforts for previously paid vacant property taxes are also a possibility.
And I guess just to follow up, are you aware where most of the vacant lots are in the city of Richmond? Because my guess is that the areas that have a lot of blight have, you know, the lots that are in areas with lower values. So that just kind of exacerbates what I've been talking about, because if you have, you know, 700 or so vacant lots in downtown Richmond, and it's pretty impossible to be able to build or develop that lot and get a value that makes it worthwhile, it seems to perpetuate the issue. So that's just like, you know, when we're up in the hills or in other areas, it's pretty easy to get people to want to build on lots. But when, you know, we're in blighted areas where the values aren't that high, it's really hard to make those numbers work. So just get back to my point in terms of trying to incentivize on the other end to find other ways to get people to build, you know, just seems like a better way to go about things.
Yes, thank you. And yes, the distribution of the vacant property has certainly been one of the things that's been explored. So thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Mike. We are going to move on to back to Lisa.
Hi, so I kind of want to give a little context here before I kind of give my thoughts on some possible exemptions. You know, this, again, it's another tax coming in the midst of a pandemic. We've also, the city of Richmond has the most draconian rent control and just cause eviction ordinance around, with very steep owner move-in relocation fees. It also passed one of the most comprehensive eviction moratorium policies associated with COVID that prevented a landlord from even receiving documentation supporting a tenant's claims that they had a COVID-related impact. And as a result of all this, there are still many small housing providers that have no real recourse to recover tens of thousands of dollars in rent that are owed to them, contrary to the narrative that's being told by various groups and on the news media. That's not the reality. And our policies in this city are doing everything to discourage people from renting out their property for fear of losing control over it, while simultaneously encouraging our small housing providers to sell their properties. All of this is going to exacerbate our existing housing crisis. Now put on top of that, Measure U, which is just now being enacted starting this month. This is the new gross receipts business tax, and it is the most expensive tax in the entire Bay Area. And this policy is going to encourage businesses to leave Richmond. It's also going to discourage new ones from coming here. So I think the city really needs to think about their policies going forward and the messages it's sending to our very critical supply network in this city, our housing providers, our commercial property landlords, and our businesses. They're all critical to our city, our residents, and our sources of revenue. So I think at a minimum, the city should consider some exemptions, like all landlords, both residential and commercial, who have not received 100% of all back-owed rent. 2, any property subject to owner move-in relocation fees. So for example, single-family homeowners that can't take the risk of renting out their home for fear of losing control over the property if it's rented out for more than a year. This is not helping our housing supply. And if a commercial property owner can't lease out their space due to Measure U because of an inability to attract a business owner to come here, they shouldn't have to pay this vacant property tax. This is, again, it gets back to my initial question. What is the purpose of this tax? If it's to address our city's general fund and our budget deficits, the city has received a whole host of other recommendations by their outside consultant on ways to do this and to bring some balance to this. And as Mike nicely spoke to, there are ways to incentivize, to develop your properties and to rent them out and to help business owners and small housing providers. And then there's ways to just make things more punitive and just create more chaos in the city. And I don't understand what the city's purpose is right here. It's really not clear to me. And I think until that is clearly defined and some more of these exemptions hopefully incorporated into it, I think it's going to be difficult to get good buy-in on this. So that's my long comment. I apologize for the breadth of it, but this is a really important concept and topic, and people are feeling taxed to death. So.
Well, those are great comments. Thank you, Lisa. Certainly registered and appreciate those comments.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for your feedback. We are going to head over into the chat and read a couple of the comments and questions. I deeply apologize in advance for if I mispronounced your name. Trianda, she commented, completely agree about no exemptions for nonprofits. Many have moved into Richmond in the past because it was inexpensive and now line streets like Barrett and McDonald with unused storefronts. On to the next, from Lisa. Were the VPT in Oakland and Vancouver both passed as special use taxes?
So I can certainly answer the question about the Oakland tax is a special use tax. The Vancouver tax, I cannot say for sure in terms of how that was set up and where the revenue is going and whether it was general as well as also special tax. I think they have a slightly different tax use structure with their ordinance. The Oakland tax went to illegal dumping, code enforcement, homeless services, and those types of special uses.
Another question from Lisa. How do you address blight on a person's property if you give them an exemption due to income status? How are they held accountable?
That's a great question. So if the ordinance was to include a requirement that for exemption, the property be in code compliance, that scenario wouldn't really ever happen, and so that they would essentially be held accountable because the tax would be due. They wouldn't be approved for an exemption due to the condition of the property. So I think what you essentially have done, you've really provided a valuable comment. It sounds like you believe that a property should not qualify for exemption if it's blighted or a nuisance. So thanks for that. That's valuable feedback.
Our next question is from what constitutes a vacant property? If a homeowner was absent for 2 years but kept their property maintained, would they fall into this category? What if it was 3 years more? Is it the condition of the property or the absence that determines if they would be liable for the tax?
Thank you, Samantha. Yes, for reading that. So this property would potentially be subject to the tax if if the city included a blight requirement. The property wouldn't be subject to the tax if the home was maintained. If there is no blight requirement for a property to be subject to the tax, this homeowner, if the property is left vacant and unused, unoccupied for, if the property's for 50 days or 30 days in the year, no one's living there at all, that property would be subject to the tax.
I also see his hand is raised, so I will allow you to talk. If you can unmute yourself for us, please. Please unmute yourself.
I did not mean to raise my hand.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. My apologies.
We will go back to the comments and questions in the chat. The next one is from Lisa. She noted and commented that there's a big difference between taxing someone and encouraging them to develop a property. The next question is from Anne. If someone is holding onto a property because they are surfing the value up wave, would 3 to 8K a month really deter them? It seems like a small amount of people paying in property. It seems like a small amount of people playing in property purchase dollars. And then the next and last question in the chat is from Mia. What was the methodology for determining the tax rates?
Great question, Mia. So the tax rates are really based on a hybrid approach. The idea between condominium properties being charged at a $3,000 rate versus vacant lots charged between $3,000 and $8,000 per year based on the parcel size. These are really just approaches that are under development, but the idea is that larger properties could be they could be more valuable. B, they could attract more blight, and these all are part of the considerations that went into the tiered tax rate approach based on the size of the property.
Awesome. Well, that is it for our questions. And thank you, everyone. We did go over a little bit. I appreciate everybody staying with us and allowing us to finish all of our questions. Oh, wait, we got one more.
Sounds
right.
like so merging two properties to build one property. If the city may have denied an application to merge a property, but if the property is a single parcel, it'll get charged the per parcel tax rate. So in that example, if the city denied an application for a parcel merger, both properties would be subject to the tax.
Any last questions? I will talk slowly in case anybody is typing. Oh, part two is a question.
Part two, so neither is buildable size. You raise a really intricate kind of consideration. There is an exemption for parcels that are undevelopable due to physical circumstances of the property. And so if the property, the city's land use ordinance does set out specific parcel size requirements necessary for development. And so those properties would potentially be exemptable based on the size of the property.
Awesome. I think that's it. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. If you have any further questions that pop up later on, feel free to send us an email at potential, V as in Victor, P as in Paul, T as in Tom, at ci.richmond.ca.us. Also, feel free to give us a call at 510-620-6512. Please ask for Samantha. And then also, we definitely encourage everybody to check out our website as well as sign up for the city manager's weekly listserv. We do try to post any information, updates, workshops in that listserv as much as we can. So with that, I think we can end the workshop, and thank you everyone. Thank you SCI. Thank you all the city staff members who are here this evening. Thank you all the attendees for your comments, your questions. We greatly appreciate all of the feedback, input, and we'll definitely include that as we move forward and discuss this.
Yes, thank you very much, Samantha, and thank you to everyone for your really great feedback tonight.
Thank you. Bye everyone. Have a nice evening.
Take care.
Bye.